cancel it. The question answer is cancel it. The question is prison, that and the answer is cancel it. We could do it with the movement, baby, you can bet your ass on that. The question is how much of it, the answer is all of it. The question is how many for, the answer is all of us. The question is should that exist, the answer is abolish it. We can do it if we do it as a union of borrowers. If the question is student debt, then the answer is cancel it. Joe could do it with the movement of a pen or a pencil. It's just a fancy flick of the hand and then all of it vanishes. And then all my homies hoping to be parents get a fairer chance. I know y'all hear us in Hyderabad screaming let us catch our breath a bit. So if the question is could you shred the records of indebtedness, then the answer is just as simple as I said it is. Second question, should I get the pet? We can scatter you and smother you in costs that are uncovered by insurance when your hip is reconstructed. Student loans for studying the subject with substance. The ankle monitor mandated for being the plugger and engine to start to sputter. Letting you bury you under the interest, wasting your life indentured. 8 to 5 and then some, just to pad our pockets with the payments we invented. Breaking your resistance isn't an accident, it's exactly as it's intended. Y'all finish fleecing us with your greasy agreements. We can bring in a knee if we tell you no and we mean it. Y'all the ones that owe us and we are the ones behemoth. But holding what we're told before it over to you till you free us. In our fighting for collective liberation, we be taking on the titans, telling the big bankers we ain't making any payments for our hospitalizations or our cars or our credit cards. Tell them they should thank us for all the paper they making off the weight of all our student loans. Can't pay, won't pay. Time to tell them looters no. From Seattle to Nevada, Lewisburg to Louisville. In privatization and erase the debts we shouldn't owe. I'm serious, abolish it. Give us free college and joblessness. Give free healthcare to all of us. We can't pay, so we won't pay. Unite and dead strike, cause together we own the whole thing. The question is student debt and the answer is cancel it. The question is medical debt, the answer is cancel it. The question is prison debt and the answer is cancel it. You can do it with the movement, baby, you can bet your ass on that. The question is how much of it, the answer is all of it. The question is how many for, the answer is all of us. The question is should that exist, the answer is abolish it. We can do it if we do it with the union of borrowers. We can do it with the movement in the end. You can bet your ass on that. You can bet your ass on that. You can bet your ass on that. We can do it with the movement and the answer is all of us. And you can bet your ass on that.
Hello, everyone. How are we feeling today? Awesome. So great to see so many of you all today joining us. Shout out to our introduction video today. That was The Whole Bank by Lingua Franca. And I just want to congratulate all of you all on completing Module 3 of the summer school course. And I want to formally welcome you all to Module 4. So last module, we talked about the past, right? Specifically, our history of struggle in the world and in the United States specifically. In last week's classes, we talked about Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Revolution, or the first and second Reconstructions, if you will, which showed us the actuality and possibility of poor and working class people uniting and organizing together under their own leadership, posing a real threat to power and the ruling class, and being able to implement revolutionary change of a grand scale in this country, here in the United States. In Module 4, which we start today, we look to the future. And we think about, the future of society, what it could look like here in the United States when the workers take power, right? Which is the name of our module that we're entering today, Module 4. And we have a great class for you all today. Our instructors for today will talk about the vision for a third Reconstruction here in the United States, and they'll make the case for why it should be a socialist one. So I'm really excited to introduce our instructors for today. We'll have Ben Becker and Satya Vati. Ben, that's right. Ben is a member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and a contributor to the book Socialist Reconstruction. And Satya is a nurse and organizer with the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, based in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'll welcome them up. Please join me in welcoming up Ben and Satya.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks to everyone who's also joining online. I know there are many of you joining remotely week after week, and I want to just thank again all the hard work and staff of the People's Forum who put this together. It's almost amazing to think of what the state of political education in the United States before 7 years ago, before the founding of the People's Forum. There was no national coordinated socialism classes every summer, which now is almost like a human right for us. There must be a socialist summer school every summer, but it's a huge advance for all the social movements that this place exists and continues to put on courses like this. I think it would be very useful before we move straight into the future to speak a little bit about the classes that Eugene Perrier and Amari Butler, our chair today, that they did the last week about the first and second Reconstructions. Because if we recall, what they were doing with that project was sort of recovering this history that's otherwise been erased. I think they asked people to raise their hands about who had known what. For me, I've been a history teacher with like the basic history, but actually very few people know the basic history of struggle in this country and the radical and in fact revolutionary history that's been intentionally suppressed. It's not just that people don't care about history. It's actually not taught, or it's taught in such a way that it's not alive. It's sort of presented as dead history. And what they revealed to us was that during both the first and second Reconstructions, there was a profound legal, political movement that changed people's conception of what was possible in this country. They changed the culture of the country. They introduced sweeping reforms to education, to healthcare, voting rights. They made illegal the form of apartheid, Jim Crow apartheid, that existed for 100 years. That's what made the second Reconstruction necessary, was that the unfinished revolution of the first Reconstruction. But then, and they didn't get to go into depth into this, but I think as we've seen in our recent period, there's been a rolling back of all the reforms won in the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement or the Civil Rights Revolution. And what both the first and second Reconstructions raised was the idea that ultimately movements against racism, against discrimination, against oppression, ultimately also had to touch the economic system. That without an economic reordering or a reorganization of society, you wouldn't really be able to uproot exploitation and oppression. And in the case of the first Reconstruction, for instance, 40 acres and a mule, the promise of land reform was never realized. And the old ruling class of the South was able to regain their power, and they did that through terror, and they also did that through legal disenfranchisement. And in the case of the second Reconstruction, Dr. King, in his last years, was focusing on a poor people's campaign, a poor people's movement that would unite working class and poor people across backgrounds to take on the entrenched power structures and economic structures of this country. And of course, he was killed at a sanitation workers' strike in 1968. So as the movement for political and legal reform focuses in on capitalist power and ruling class power, it becomes more explosive, it becomes even more threatening, and it is shut down, or it was shut down in those two instances. I say all this not to be a pessimist at all, but to really put firmly on the table what the next Reconstruction would have to be. It wouldn't have to be just for legal and political reform, not to diminish that, I shouldn't even say the word just, because those were deep reforms, but to actually consolidate those reforms and make those reforms permanent. It has to also have an economic reorganization of society. The famous quote that John Lewis and others used in the Civil Rights Movement, what's the point of getting the right to sit at the counter, the lunch counter, if you can't afford a cheeseburger, right? That actually black people needed economic power, not just integration. And of course, that whole struggle for economic power is the one that's been erased. And the economic radicalism of Dr. King has been erased. But the open secret, the thing that is easy to find but never gets taught in our elementary schools, is that Dr. King was always a socialist. They referenced it Eugene referenced it in the last class, that in 1952, during the courtship of Martin Luther King Jr., not yet a doctor, while he was in school, he was 22 years old, and speaking with Coretta Scott, she gave him a book to read, and it was quite a radical book. And in his letters, he's reflecting on the book, and he says, well, I'm convinced about the general purpose of this book, which is that capitalism has outlived its usefulness. And in this letter with Coretta Scott, he's 22 years old. He's already saying, I'm familiar with the works of Karl Marx. There's some things I agree with, there's some things I don't agree with, or I'm still sort of deciding on. But he says he's for the nationalization of industry. He said he's for the redistribution of wealth. He said, this is what I'm going to devote my life to. And the book, I want to talk about the book that Coretta Scott gave Dr. King. I think she was probably trying to see if he's like really about it, you know? Like she gave him this book and was like, I want to make sure you're as radical as I am before we continue this courtship. So the book she gave him, if we can, oh, I got the clicker. It's a book called Looking Backward, which was published in 1887. The actual title is Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. So I bet not many people have read this book. Any show of hands? Anyone read it? Okay. It's actually the second best-selling novel of the 19th century. after Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was a hit. It was a huge hit when it came out. It sold over 1 million copies. So in the story, the main character, whose name is Julian West, he has terrible sleep habits. He's always getting woken up. He sleeps very lightly. So he builds an underground chamber in his house that's secret, nobody knows about, so he can finally get some rest. And his house burns down, and everyone thinks he's lost in the fire. But in fact, shortly before getting his sleep, he was put under hypnosis. So instead of ever waking up, he's just hypnotized for the next 113 years. And he wakes up in the year 2000 when the new homeowner stumbles upon this hidden little room in the basement. And it's like, oh, there's a guy in here. And he wakes up, and it's year 2000, and he's totally shocked by the society that he finds. Now remember, this book is written in 1887, because in 2000 he finds that there's perfect equality, there's perfect economic equality, there's no violence or crime in society, all industries have been nationalized, there's no politicians, there's no soldiers, there's no special police even, since there's no crime, what would they do? Everything is super clean, and in fact, there's not even wages. People work, but they're not, what they're given is actually a little credit card. And this is actually the first known use of the word credit card. So this guy actually invents the word credit card. But it's not a credit card like we're used to it, like a predatory company. It's that all of the work of society gets divided up into a little credit system. And so if, $1 trillion are, produced, $1 trillion of value, and then there's 1,000 people, then each person would get $1 billion. That's a very weird arithmetic there, but you see the point. So you get a little card, and then you go into a shop and you buy whatever you want. This was the original credit card system. Anyway. There's also big superstores. When I read it, I kind of think of Costco or like BJ's, where you go and there's basically all the products that are produced in society are there, and use your little credit card on that. So this book, I'm saying it not because this is necessarily our exact model for socialism in the 21st century, but a book of this nature in 1887, it was obviously a critique of his era, a critique of the Gilded Age, of the Industrial Revolution, which was producing enormous amounts of goods, enormous amounts of wealth, but enormous economic inequality, huge hardship, huge exploitation. The factory life was absolutely deadly back then. The urban slums were terrible. The crime was terrible. The racism, the oppression. And this was his way of saying all of the technological power of our society could be basically rationalized to get rid of all these problems. So the character is looking back at 1887 and thinking, wow, we had it all wrong, and what a nightmare that was compared to 2000. In that period of 2000 in his future society, the way you get people to do harder work is you allow them to work less. So for instance, if your job is like really hard, you would only work a couple hours. But if your work is pretty easy, you would work a longer work day. That's how they incentivize free time. And in his society, he's walking around, everybody's, they're just doing whatever they want. There's lots of cultural work, there's lots of painting and music, because they've already exactly assessed how much food and how much of this to make and how much of that to make, and they've rationalized the entire labor system. So this is the book that Coretta Scott gives to Martin Luther King Jr. and says, what do you think? And he says, this is a prophecy. We got to make this happen. This sounds amazing. And if you think about it, why does a book like that catch on in 1887? Right after the book is published, not only do they sell 1 million copies, book clubs get created all across the United States. And there's chapters of Bellamyites, right? Because there's a book by Edward Bellamy. The Bellamyites and their vision for the nationalization of industry and to totally change the labor system and to solve all these social problems, it catches on. It becomes a mass social movement. The idea of the book actually creates a social movement. And those ideas then percolate into the populist movement, the farmers movement, the labor movement, the early socialist movement. So this book, again, a book that is super famous, but not taught like in our elementary schools the way others are, because it's essentially a socialist handbook of sorts, and it popularized socialism. And the more you read books like this, you start to think, oh, maybe it could be a different way. I think this is a big problem. It's not just me. You know, many of us in the left recognize this is a big problem of our movement. If we are unable to articulate what the next stage of human development or the next stage of society looks like, or what socialism looks like, how can we really build a powerful movement to that end? Is it sufficient to say, for instance, we are against this, this, and this? We are against this form of injustice, that form of injustice. We are for a world without this injustice. That's usually where we stop our rhetoric. But the only way to really captivate the masses of people and to make them fight for something is they have to know what that something is. And in fact, once the idea of a future society is almost like you can touch it, it's realizable, then everyone who stands in the way of that is seen as essentially retrograde, a reactionary, a criminal. You know, and Satya is going to talk about healthcare. I think more and more people recognize that healthcare should just be a right. And in that sense, the things that, you know, maybe 50 years ago, I don't know if people did think of it that way. But because you think healthcare is a right, now you view the insurance companies differently. Because now you realize they are not providing a service. They are simply there to deny a right, right? And so you see the whole insurance industry is essentially a parasitic imposition blocking people from the right. But imagine if it wasn't just healthcare we were talking about, but all basic human needs. Here's a little drawing of this future utopia. It's from this book that we put out, Socialist Reconstruction, which I hope everyone can pick up, which lays out exactly these points that I'm making. What would an energy system look like? What would an agricultural system look like? What would a transportation system look like? What would an education system look like under socialism? The book doesn't deal with the question of how we get there. You know, it doesn't deal with the question of political struggle and revolution. It just basically says, what could it look like? In a way, it's our version, this book, Socialist Reconstruction, of looking backward, trying to present the idea to people. You know, it's been said by many different political theorists that it's easier to imagine, for most people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I bet you that's today quite true, especially because we're not reading books like Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. Instead, we're consuming movies like this. In fact, if you could indulge me to, let's say, if we all were to think about what is 2050, like right now it's 2025, 2050, what's 2050 going to look like? Let's actually, instead of shouting out, let's close our eyes for a minute, just 30 seconds. What is 2050? Where do you see the world in 2050? Realistically, right? Where's it going? Okay, let's open our eyes. I would bet most people either are seeing basically the present, but even worse, like some sort of high-tech digital dictatorship based on the total displacement of workers and artificial intelligence, where we have like zero rights. Or for people who are a little even more pessimistic than that, it's sort of this dog-eat-dog, end of the world, Hobbesian, you know, everyone for themselves, doomsday prepper kind of future, right? So it's either like one or the other, like a very high-tech version where you have no rights and are totally controlled, or a very low-tech version where we're all basically cutting each other's throats to survive and get like drinking water. So, and in both scenarios, I think we assume that climate change has totally wrecked everything. In fact, if you look at polls, under 10% of people think there's anything that can be done to stop irreversible, or to stop climate catastrophe. That means even people who believe in it. No one actually believes anything can be done. But in both those scenarios, both are premised on the continuation of the capitalist system. Whether it's the low-tech version or the high-tech version, it's assuming that capitalist property remains the central organizing principle for society as a whole. So what we want to lay out is a totally different vision from these kinds of movies, and that would be of a high-tech socialism. Now, what is the basic fundamentals of socialism in our current era? One, as in looking backward, the social ownership of the means of production. Two, economic planning, rational, deliberate economic planning is the organizing principle for production. Three, the abolition of intellectual property, which I'll talk a little bit about. We could list a few of them. We could also say the abolition of debt, or the definancialization of the economy is another central aspect of this future economy. Now, some people say, well, you can't nationalize things. That would suppress free competition, right? If you put all the auto companies into one giant government-owned auto industry, or all the energy companies, or all the big ag, that would suppress competition. But the truth is, all of the main industries, the core industries, the commanding heights of the economy, are already totally without competition in reality. So when we say the socialization of the means of production, social ownership of the means of production, we're not talking about people's private houses. We're not talking about people's personal property. Private property, at this scale, we're talking about the things that produce value, the means of production. So for instance, big tech, big ag, the big four in auto, big oil, big pharma, the big banks. What we're really talking about are 4 to 10 companies right now that in most cases control 80 to 90% of their industries. 80 to 90%. So actually, they've sort of laid the table for us. It's really just taking those 4 or 5 companies and combining them and putting them under people's control. It's actually the transition to socialism compared to, say, Russia in 1917 or China in 1949, in the United States, the economic preconditions for socialism have already been laid. The Fortune 500 controls about 2/3 of the country's GDP. That's just 500 companies. 2/3 of the GDP of the United States is in 500 companies. Many of them don't even pretend to be in favor of competition. Peter Thiel, if you listen to him, says competition is for losers. He says that's his like slogan. He says the goal should be to actually create monopolies. And we have a phone that's ringing. Someone can get it. Okay, cool, thank you. If you think about it, what is that for? Like, why do we need the 4 airlines that control 90%, right? So if you were to rationalize them, put them under one ownership, you eliminate a lot of waste, but most importantly, those 4 companies are all designed around who can make the most profits to attract more investments. And so even though there's 4 giant ones, they make so much money, their prerogative is still, who can cut costs the most, who can offload environmental costs the most, who can skimp on safety the most, right? So in each case, if you go through each of these industries, the profit motive is still the central organizing principle, even though they're totally integrated as one big company. So all we would do is take over the companies and say, now we are going to, instead of making decisions about how much gets produced and how much is charged for it, we're going to make those decisions according to an economic plan. Economic planning is also something that gets talked about as a totally scary idea. But in fact, economic planning already takes place. It's just who does the economic planning right now? Have you ever been involved in economic planning? I don't think anyone here really has been. But it does take place. It takes place in corporate boardrooms. And it's often the banks that play the decisive role in planning each and every corporation's next round of investments. Because the capital expenses required to make big investments, whether you're in this industry or that industry, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, which means you have to go to the banks. So the banks function as the central planners of the current economy. They decide whether something gets the green light or the red light. What are they making that decision based on? Purely the profit motive. And it's not just short-term profits, but long-term profits. Here's an example. Uber did not return a profit for many years. I believe its first 10 years. Amazon, too, did not turn a profit for 10 years. So how is it that the CEOs and the stock prices of Uber and Amazon could be so high, it could be worth billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars while they're not turning a profit, meaning they're spending more than they're taking in those year after year? It's because the investors are betting long-term that these corporations will take such a giant share of the rest of the market in the long term, that Amazon will destroy all your local small businesses, that Uber will destroy all the taxi companies, so that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, they'll be essentially a monopoly that can raise the prices and do whatever they want. And that having put everything into these one giant companies, they'll be able to shave lots of labor costs and so forth. In other words, they are thinking long term, based on their investors' demands for them to return consistent profits year after year, quarter after quarter. So economic planning, again, could just be changed from economic planning for profit to economic planning for the needs of the people and the planet. It's actually quite simple. If you look at the magnificent seven stocks, so to speak, the big seven, in Wall Street right now, there's 7 stocks that have made up a majority of stock market gains in the last couple years. It's Meta, Amazon, Google, Nvidia, Microsoft, Tesla, and I've forgotten one. But in any case, they're all tech stocks. How is it that they are playing such a big role in the stock market? Right? They have assets under their control, or their market cap actually, exceeds whole countries. All of that is because each of those companies is in a race, essentially, for artificial intelligence, where they can have windfall, permanent profits, is their view, based on the total destruction of the workforce. Like Tesla produces far fewer cars than Toyota, but its stock price is way over Toyota's or General Motors. It has nothing to do with actually the number of cars it sells. It's because Tesla has intellectual property over self-driving cars and electric batteries, which they assume are going to, at some point, destroy and reorganize entire industries. So the stock valuations are totally premised, in other words, on stealing future workers' labor. It's not even based on how many cars they've sold right now. It's that they're betting that they're going to be so dominant in the future that they're going to up the valuation of their stock now, and that's what makes Elon Musk the richest person in the world. Their share of future value. So it's, in a way, a fictitious capital that's been created that we could immediately abolish, but they're using that fictitious capital in a very real way. They're buying yachts, they're taking out loans, they're buying homes, they're buying single-family homes, they're speculating on land, all based on the premise that this small group of capitalists will control the wealth in perpetuity and control the technology that will decide, in other words, who works and who doesn't, and where the profits go. I want to show a couple graphs. This is the graph of productivity. From 1948 to 1972, wages pretty much stayed in line with productivity. This is a very famous graph, so maybe you've seen it before. But for the last 50-some years, productivity has skyrocketed thanks to technology, but the wages have been flat. And there's many different reasons for that. But the point being, this is a permanent feature of capitalism. It doesn't really matter who the president is. It doesn't matter who's in Congress. It doesn't matter who's in local government. I mean, those positions are important. I'm not saying they don't make important decisions, but the fundamental trends of capitalism are this. So where did all that money go, right? Productivity's way up, but wages are flat. Remember, in this book, Looking Backward, the writer said, if productivity goes way up, shouldn't we just have to work less? I mean, these are basic questions that nobody asks. If productivity is up, shouldn't we need to work less? John Maynard Keynes, the economist, not a revolutionary, in 1930, he predicted by 2030 that everyone would work 15-hour work weeks based on the general trends, right? And based on the trends of productivity. He was right about the productivity, but he's definitely not right about the work week, as we can all attest, right? I see some tired faces, people coming from work, right? So where did all that wealth go? Here is there we go. All right, so it's starting in 91. This is month by month, the wealth of the top 0.1% versus the bottom 50%. So here's the inequality going up. Let me see if I can narrate this like a sports broadcaster. No. You might be thinking, wow, things got really bad right before the financial crisis. True. Here's the financial crisis hits. The top 1% takes a little hit. It's just a moment, though. Don't worry about them. They're coming back. And look at us in the bottom 50%. We're just eking along. That soaring wealth was the pandemic. So, sorry, I wish I had frozen at the top there. But the pandemic, which many of us look back as a nightmarish moment, was the best moment ever for billionaires. Just think about if you were an alien arriving on this planet, and you say, wow, you really had a rough year, or a rough 2 years. Millions of people dead, everything shut down, whole lives disrupted. But then the idea that the billionaire's wealth increases at a faster rate than ever before during the pandemic, these are the absurd contradictions of capitalism that we've totally normalized because we've been taught that they're basically natural, they're human nature. I'm going past my time a little bit, so I want to go a little faster. The premise of economic planning is that as a society, and especially the working class, not just through one party, but through mass organizations, get to collectively discuss what are our priorities. So, for instance, how many people here have ever gotten to vote on what the rent should be? No hands. How many people ever got to vote on what the cost of groceries should be, or oil, or gas? Or have you ever got to vote on what sort of cultural products you want to see, or how about the social media algorithm? You know, that thing that's causing mass depression among young people and young women in particular, according to statistics, it's like off the charts, but there's no way to rectify that, apparently. Like all these things that totally determine how we live our lives. People are making decisions about all that, but you're just not a part of those. You're not a part of those discussions. You are just a worker or a consumer or a tenant. You don't make any of those decisions. So the idea is all the decision making should be put in the hands of mass organizations, community organizations, grassroots institutions, representative institutions. They should be merged with the highest advances in science and data collection. In fact, economic planning today would be way easier than under the Soviet Union, for instance. With our phones, we could be submitting things constantly, complaints, we could be collecting things, we could have AI processing, you know, what are the problems almost the moment they arrive, and you would have local organizations to then to say, hey, this is not going the way we decided, and they would be able to enforce decisions. That's the essence of what we mean by planning. It's not like a small group of planners, but in fact, you could engage all of society in, for instance, what are the external costs or the real costs, the true costs of fossil fuel production. Right now, those are all calculated based on simply what the corporation has to pay for. But if it creates huge costs and huge damage to the environment, to the people living there or to the whole planet, that's not part of the costs of production. So you would be able to actually have a totally different accounting system you would need to develop to figure out what are the costs or the risks, the pros and cons, the benefit analysis, so to speak, of every decision. There's a saying in cybernetics that was developed that was, I don't know if people know this phrase, a purpose of a system is what it does. A purpose of a system is what it does. I think it's worth thinking about this phrase because I think for a lot of us, we were trained to think that if there are injustices or inequality in the American political and economic system, that's like a problem of not voting in the right people. And that, in fact, the constitutional order is good. The US Constitution is a good thing. And it's just been sort of corrupted. But this phrase that comes out of cybernetics, as I said, it says, if a system consistently fails at its stated purpose, but it's not changed, consider that the stated purpose is less important than the actual hidden purpose at which it is succeeding. So, in other words, if you develop this kind of economic inequality year after year, year after year, maybe that is the purpose. Maybe that is the purpose of the economic and political system. The fact that all the political interventions year after year can't affect that, it does raise that question, doesn't it? That maybe liberty and justice for all is just rhetoric. And that in fact, the constitutional order has been designed not to check individual power. I mean, look at Donald Trump. The constitutional system has been designed to check our power. And in fact, a socialist political system would not have checks and balances. Would not have checks and balances. Now, many of us are like, oh, checks and balances, we need that. But actually, why were checks and balances developed to begin with? Well, let's listen to them directly. James Madison, in explaining why they needed a Senate, this is why they developed a Senate in the US Constitution. Someone want to read for me? You don't have to impersonate James Madison.
An increase of population will of necessity increase the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings. These may in time outnumber those who are placed above the feelings of indigence. According to the equal laws of suffrage,
Meaning the right to vote.
according to the equal laws of suffrage, the power will slide into the hands of the former. No agrarian attempts have yet been made in this country, but symptoms of a leveling spirit, as we have understood, have sufficiently appeared in a certain quarters to give notice of the future danger. How is this danger to be guarded against on Republican principles? James Madison, 1787.
So this was the explanation for a Senate. There's some of the language is a little outmoded, so we might have to read it a few times. But a leveling spirit, meaning a desire for redistribution, will grow as inequality grows, and as the amount of rich are reduced in percentage compared to the overall population. If we just were to have a House of Representatives, this is his fear, they'll vote to take away our property. So we need a second institution that will be composed totally of rich people. And they said this. They said they will be composed totally of rich people. In fact, there was a narrow vote to not even have the Senate be a paid position. They said if we have it be a paid position, there might be some poor people get in there. So we want just rich people in there who don't need the money. That way, if it's unpaid, it'll be all rich people, and they'll make sure no bad laws get passed. Agrarian attempts is this. So basically, the sort of farmers' revolts is what he's referring to. There haven't been any farmers' revolts yet, but they are symptoms of it. And he was correct. Right after the Constitution is passed, there's mass farmers' revolts for different reasons, which we won't get into now. So, again, the purpose of a system is what it does, not what its stated rhetoric is. So, under a socialist system, you would have a constitution that guarantees as basic rights the right to housing, the right to health care, the right to food, the right to clean water, the right to work, the right to culture. The U.S. Constitution purely consists of things the government, your rights are things the government can't do to you. But there are no positive rights in the U.S. Constitution. There are no rights where the government is obligated to make sure that you have X, Y, and Z. So our sort of, this sort of love for the Constitution, that it hasn't changed in a quarter of a millennia, which we're going to celebrate next year and all the things, that's nothing to celebrate, right? In fact, the technology has now far outstripped what anybody could conceive of in the 1770s and 1780s, and allows for the total guarantee of all those human rights, all those human needs as human rights. It is not complicated at all. We have a system that's wasting 30% of the food in this country, and yet there are people who are hungry. We have a system where there are 16 vacant housing units for every homeless person. You're telling me there's no way a homeless person can be put in one of those 16 so that then there could be 15 vacant housing units? I mean, the total irrationality of the system has been so normalized and naturalized precisely because we assume the corporations will plan better. But the corporations will never plan better. The corporations will always plan for their private profits. So we need to abolish the Senate. We need to abolish the Supreme Court, which its permanent judicial appointments just allows them to not be at all subject to the people's desires. And for instance, instead of a Senate, why don't we create an assembly of oppressed nationalities? Here's an idea. So that any law, it has to pass first the House of Representatives, which will be based on district, and second, it has to pass the Assembly of Oppressed Nationalities, composed totally of people who have been historically colonized and oppressed in this country, so that no law can be passed that's racist. Like a racist majority couldn't pass a racist law. That's right. Like there's another way of thinking about a political system. The whole idea, the whole federal system, the states' rights, all that does has been a way to preserve property rights and hold back Congress. There's no reason any progressive should be defending the federal system. So we have to rethink all of these things that we sort of inherit as natural and normal United States. I think it's important that we do this as a matter of urgency because, and this is our view in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, part of the reason why the social movements have been so weak, so divided, so atomized, sort of thinking of themselves as single issue movements. You have this movement, that movement, this movement, is that there's no common political horizon. What is the thing we're all fighting for? Once you establish the thing we're all fighting for, then that compels unity, because you realize what we need to get there. If you assume we can't win, we won't win, that this system is going to be here forever, then that lowers your horizon and you say, well, let me just take a little piecemeal concession at the expense of the next person. Once you see that the whole system could be reorganized to provide for human needs as a matter of human rights, and that requires political power for the working class, and the political power for the working class will only come through a revolution, that changes the whole way you organize in whatever little struggle you're involved in today. And we're for involving ourselves in every little struggle. But what unites us in all of our struggles is that we have a common vision of what we're fighting for. And that's what they had in the 1960s and 70s. Those were the radical movements of the Black Panther Party, of the socialist and communist movements. They had that. And that's what's been taken away from us, and that's what we have to rebuild. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. First, before I begin, I just want to thank the People's Forum for organizing this amazing summer school and also for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Ben set me up really well. So one of the first things a new working class revolution would take up is the drafting and adoption of a new constitution. So millions of people will mobilize and participate in the drafting of this new constitution. And among many other things, a new socialist constitution, like Ben said, would enshrine the right of healthcare, housing, education as inalienable and guaranteed constitutional rights. So that means that exploitation, racism, sexism, discrimination, and bigotry in all forms would be outlawed. And the hoarding of wealth and any attempt to make profits from the exploitation of other people would be made illegal and a crime. So if we apply the core principles of using the wealth and resources of society to meet people's needs and to protect the planet, if we abolish private property, nationalize industries and land, and centralize economic planning, let's go through what the healthcare system under socialism could look like. But we also can look at healthcare in a bubble. A healthy working class requires the total reorganization of education, housing, approach to policing and crime, food production, energy, the elimination of debt, the end to imperialist wars, and more. So all of these factors are linked to health. So we say that capitalism is the disease and socialism is the cure. So how many of you here have skipped going to the doctor out of fear of cost and debt? You can raise your hand. Exactly. And this is very reflective of the experience of the working class in society today. So lack of healthcare for the working class is a form of oppression. And healthcare is a particularly horrific, unjust, and inhumane industry under capitalism. The entire US healthcare system is centered around generating profits for corporations owned by billionaires. And it's not about saving lives or keeping people healthy. That's actually just incidental. Healthcare is a commodity, something to be sold and bought for profit. And capitalism loves to blame working class people for bad health. We are responsible for our bad health under capitalism. But the reality is that capitalism is making us sick and killing us. People are suffering from unnecessary diseases and dying unnecessary deaths. Healthcare in this country is a system of emergency care, not primary care and prevention, because there is no money to be made in preventing disease. And if we were all healthy, how will the billionaires make billions? There is just too much profit to be made off sick people. So we see the cross-section of the common issues of poverty, hunger, housing insecurity, violence, illiteracy, lack of access to transportation, technology, and healthcare. And this is in the richest country in the world. We see that chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and obesity are directly linked to chronic stress, lack of safe housing, poor diet, financial insecurity, insufficient exercise. Our life expectancy in this country is actually declining. And the capitalist healthcare industry is a criminal enterprise. It's legalized robbery at the cost of millions of lives. So under socialism, the healthcare industrial complex would be totally dismantled. The socialist government would immediately disband the for-profit healthcare model. Medicine would be totally socialized. Healthcare would be completely free. We would build a centralized healthcare system and not a patchwork of plans and policies that vary state by state and serve some people and not others, as is the case under capitalism. The corporations that privately own hospitals would be abolished. Hospitals would immediately be brought under public control. Right now, the top 10 largest health systems in the country privately own some 1,400 hospitals and rake in billions of dollars every single year. And these same corporations are shutting down clinics and hospitals, serving low-income and rural communities across the country. Socialism, in contrast, would bring high-quality healthcare to rural and currently underserved areas. We would actually build more hospitals and primary care clinics at the neighborhood level that would integrate mental health and reproductive health services across the country. Under socialism, we would also see workplace democracy, and all sectors in society would have the right to unionize. Healthcare workers themselves will help shape healthcare under socialism. The slogan, "Workers make the world run, workers should run the world," is not an empty slogan. This would really be the case under socialism. Because we as workers know what works and what doesn't work in our workplaces. We know what we need and what needs to change, what needs to improve and how it needs to improve. All workers would have the right to a union, the right to be organized under socialism. We would create democratic norms in our workplaces and neighborhoods. We would have elected leadership in our workspaces. Decision-making would happen in our workplaces at the neighborhood level, at the regional level, in conjunction with national priorities and planning. And rather than the top-down model of planning we see under capitalism, which Ben spoke to, socialism uses a model of centralization that is both top-down and bottom-up, a model that is flexible, dynamic, democratic, that creates dialogue at a societal level. And federal agencies will use national, regional, and local mass organizations to achieve this. Millions of volunteers will be mobilized to intervene directly in the building and shaping of all aspects of society, including the healthcare system. Something that we would immediately do when we have a revolution in this country is the private healthcare insurance companies would be dissolved. The healthcare insurance industry would no longer exist under socialism. This is a parasitic industry. The insurance companies make billions by denying and delaying coverage, ramping up premiums and copays, and coming up with schemes to rob and ruin families when our loved ones are sick or injured. In 2020, in the thick of the pandemic, insurance companies made over $40 billion in profit. United Healthcare alone made $23 billion in profits in 2023. And many people who are uninsured or underinsured actually skip or delay getting treatment all the time. In 2019, a Gallup poll found that 34 million adults in the US know someone who died after not getting treatment because they were unable to pay for it. That's millions of people. And in the context of socialism, where high-quality healthcare would be the right of all people, this parasitic industry would become obsolete. And the workers in this industry would be retrained or re-educated and transitioned to work in other industries, in actually productive jobs, where their skills and expertise would be used for the benefit of humanity and not to destroy lives. And this would be the case for any job that gets eliminated under socialism if it's of no value to the collective well-being of the people. The pharmaceutical industry would be nationalized and drug patents would be abolished under socialism. Tens of millions of people in this country can't afford their medications at all or ration their medications by skipping doses. Exactly. 1 in 6 people with diabetes actually ration their insulin in this country. And I want to explain how this disproportionately impacts Black people in the South. The Black Belt states in the South are known as the diabetes belt. Counties in the South have very high rates of people with diabetes and amputations. These are often some of the poorest counties where working class people have high levels of medical debt. And nationally, Black people are 4 times more likely to suffer diabetes-related amputations than white patients. People with diabetes have a good chance of dying within 5 years of an amputation. Many of my patients undergo amputations. And this is completely preventable. And meanwhile, the 16 largest drug companies made $684 billion in profits in 2023. A socialist government would immediately seize and nationalize the pharmaceutical industry, which exploits people through price gouging. Lobbying and marketing of drugs would be abolished. All medicine would be free. So a big part of bringing the pharmaceutical industry in this country into public control means the abolition of drug patents. These patents are a deadly and insidious form of private property. Life-saving medications and technology will be nobody's private property under socialism. Because science should serve the people and the planet. Scientific research and technological innovation would be shared. We have a moral obligation and responsibility to do this with the rest of the world. Socialism would mandate collaboration and not competition among scientists. A socialist system would foster strong international relationships through knowledge sharing among those in various fields. This would actually be the standard practice. Intellectual property rights would be abolished. A socialist government would abolish all medical debt. 1 in 2 people in this country are ridden with medical debt. Medical debt is actually the leading cause of bankruptcy inside the United States. And this debt, like all debt, would be immediately and completely wiped out. And like Ben said earlier, the undemocratic Supreme Court would be abolished under socialism. Under socialism, 9 unelected judges who are appointed for life by this or that political representative of the capitalist class would not have power to determine whether hundreds of millions of women in this country should have the right to control their own bodies or not. Abortion is healthcare, and the right to abortion would be free and on demand. It would be a constitutionally guaranteed right, and this would not be up for debate. The nationalization of the healthcare industry and its reorganization would actually require the reorganization of the entire economy, particularly the reorganization of food production. This is because poor diet is a huge contributing factor to poor health. And working class people who are living paycheck to paycheck in poverty and working multiple jobs to make ends meet have little to no time to cook or money to buy healthy food. The corporate agribusiness and food industry pumps out toxic, high-calorie, high-sugar foods. Over 60% of our food is processed, and many food products in the US contain cancer-causing agents. This is because capitalist agriculture relies on overproduction for profits. And at the same time, some 50 million people in the country, many children, face hunger. Under socialism, healthy food would be a basic guaranteed right, and healthy foods will be made available free of charge, and nutrition will be a centerpiece of health intervention. Housing would also be a human right under socialism. In hospitals across the country, people who are homeless are treated just enough to be thrown back into the streets and exposed to the same elements and conditions that brought them into the hospital in the first place. Some people come in with severe frostbites during the winter and lose their limbs. Every year in this country, over 3.5 million people are homeless at some point, and half of these people are children. Housing insecurity is a huge source of stress for working class people, and so is the lack of access to reliable transportation. And under socialism, everyone who needs a home will be given one. There are over 17 million empty homes across the country. Workers build these homes, but they are owned by the banks, developers, and the landlords. Unhealthy housing is also making people sick. Asthma, cancer, lead poisoning, and other health issues. Socialism will make housing a social good. We will build high-quality public housing with low-energy infrastructure and safe building materials and build communities to foster inclusion. All new buildings will be built to be net zero for emissions. All people will access affordable, environmentally sustainable, safe, clean, spacious, and beautiful homes in a neighborhood that meets their needs. And this will overall improve the quality of health for people. Prevention and public health would be a centerpiece of socialist healthcare. The creation of neighborhood level health system would play a big role in prevention. Primary care clinics in each neighborhood with the latest technology that attend to a range of needs. A network of community health workers and volunteers from within the community who will know the people in their neighborhoods. Doctors and nurses will go to people's homes as needed. Socialism will take healthcare to the people. The pandemic also showed the whole world that there is essentially no public health infrastructure inside the US, because for decades, both major parties chose to not fund and invest in it. And 1 million people died in this country during the COVID pandemic for no other reason but because the capitalist government catered to the needs of the billionaires. It refused to take the necessary measures to protect human lives or address shortages. But any scarcity in the US economy, because of its immense productive capacity, is artificial and manufactured. Public health would be prioritized under socialism, mobilizing workers and volunteers at the grassroots level who can generate popular support for public health measures through mass education. And education under socialism would help empower the working class, because schools, universities, and colleges don't just teach us practical skills, but they're also providing us ideological training. They shape our consciousness, our worldview, our principles, and values. So education under socialism will play a key role in transforming the working class and erasing historic prejudices. The cultural consequences of capitalist ideology will take time to erase, but it can be done. The philosophy of medicine or health under capitalism is fundamentally different under socialism. Because under capitalism, the practice of medicine is tied to profits. Doctors are empowered to make decisions based on financial incentives. Socialism would produce a different type of healthcare worker with a socialist consciousness. Workers who would be motivated by the health of the community, compassion, and genuine concern and love for humanity. And we can see a clear example of this in Cuba, whose doctors serve the whole world. And the fundamental relationship between doctor and patient, nurse and patient, teacher and student changes. It's different under socialism because social relations transform when property relations are changed. And this type of fundamental change is simply not possible under capitalism. And tens of millions of people in this country under capitalism are still denied the right to education. Lifelong education would be free under socialism. The privatization of education would end. We would build more public schools, more universities, and produce more healthcare workers to meet the need. In a capitalist system, the purpose of education is to produce obedient workers, not critical thinkers who can contribute solutions to the many pressing problems that we're facing in society today. Socialist education would do the opposite and empower the working class. Students who can be of any age will not be seen as objects, but as subjects of their own learning. Capitalism is also producing a whole generation of young people suffering from mental illness, largely stemming from alienation and on-the-job oppression, financial insecurity, unemployment, lack of healthy social relationships, and isolation that cause anxiety, hopelessness, and depression. And yet, capitalist mental health focuses on brain biology and medications. A socialist government would establish community mental health services, and they would be incorporated into the neighborhood health clinics. Socialist government would also address historic disparities and eliminate inequalities. Racism is a vital public health issue under capitalism. Communities facing national oppression and special oppression face worse health outcomes. Racist mass incarceration and police brutality are also expressions of capitalist oppression of the working class and oppressed, and it impacts millions of people in this country. Millions of people from oppressed and poor communities are funneled into jails and prisons. But most of these people are incarcerated for crimes of survival or crimes of poverty. And others for taking part in get-rich-quick schemes. But in either case, capitalism creates the conditions for people to engage in these behaviors. It creates and reproduces a culture of violence. And a new socialist government would release all political prisoners and initiate a process of the direct release of the vast majority of people in jails and prisons, who will be integrated into the new socialist society. And in a small number of situations, confinement will be necessary, but it would be last resort. A socialist government would also abolish policing as we know it. It will replace all capitalist state institutions with new institutions that would be built from the ground. Every successful revolution has created a new military, self-defense, and community safety institutions to defend the revolution from counter-revolution, and we would have to do the same. A socialist government would not be able to do away with all policing and corrective institutions all at once, as long as very violent crimes exist. But we will immediately begin to address the root causes of social conflict. And over the course of time, we will be able to transform the consciousness of the people as a whole and create a new mass culture, to the point where it would become unthinkable for any person to want to commit destructive, harmful, racist, sexist, bigoted, antisocial crimes. But this takes time. But it can be done through mass mobilizations, cultural and education campaigns, and accountability processes. The state will eventually wither away in the final phase of socialism, leading to a communistic society. For majority of human existence, and human beings have existed for over 300,000 years, human beings lived communally in societies without institutions of repression, and we can do this again. We would promote relationship building for conflict resolution, use violence interruption programs. Whatever process of justice is used, we would consult with and be attentive to the needs of the most impacted. Mass organizations will play a key role in this. But accountability for those who cause harm to others would look like exclusion from certain community activities, total residential segregation, like house arrest, combined with intensive re-education and rehabilitation. For the most part, we can use alternatives. And another historic disparity we would address under socialism is the inclusion and support for people with disabilities, which will be guaranteed in the new system. All structural barriers in housing, schools, transportation, workplaces, and public spaces will be eliminated. The socialist project will build a positive culture around disabilities and encourage the full development of each person's potential. LGBTQ individuals experience discrimination and mistreatment in the capitalist healthcare system. Trans women and men face misgendering, bias, and inadequate attention to their specific needs. Socialist healthcare would be free, giving unrestricted access to reproductive, gender affirmation, and other services. Gender affirmation care is healthcare and would be a guaranteed right. And people with addictions will have free access to high-quality rehabilitation programs that are life-affirming rather than stigmatizing. The punitive war on drugs will be ended, and drug addiction will be treated as a medical issue. The bottom line is that all people will be treated with dignity and with respect, with attention to each person's special needs. Lack of funding for nursing homes and assisted living facilities under capitalism has had devastating consequences for the elderly. They are dehumanized, treated like children, and discarded. Under socialism, all the needs of the elderly population would be met, and our elders would be integrated into community life with a vibrant culture. So, in conclusion, healthcare should serve humanity, not billionaires for profits. Socialist healthcare would bring overall improvement to the quality of life for all people. Healthy outcomes, more free time, less working hours, less stress, daycare will be easily available, shorter work week, longer vacation time, paid sick leave, maternity leave. Many sources of stress would be eliminated. No anxiety around eviction, foreclosures, or debt. And socialism has already brought healthcare, housing, and education, and so much more to hundreds of millions of people in the world who were denied these basic human rights under capitalism. Socialism is the superior form of democracy, a permanent form of democracy that is participatory and popular because it will reflect the will and the decisions of tens of millions of people in the country who, with the working class in power, will finally be able to build a just society in our image. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome presentation. Give it up one more time for Ben and Satya, everyone. Great. So I'm sure you all have many questions thinking about socialist reconstruction in the United States. So we're going to take a round of in-person questions first. So raise your hand high if you have a question. And if you're on Zoom and you have a question, be sure now you can put them in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll do a second round of questions from Zoom. So raise your hand high if you have a question in person, and we'll take a couple. Great. Okay, we'll start with you.
Thank y'all for an awesome lecture. I have two questions. My first one is, once we are at a point of a proletariat dictatorship where we have seized the means of production and nationalized industries, how do we collectively benefit from particular industries or companies that require the blood and bodies from the global south as a condition of existence? How do we mediate the balance between improving the lives of the working class in this country while also being in solidarity with the working class from the global south?
Do you want to give an example just to fill it out a little more?
An example would be like Apple requiring child mining particular resources to build their phones. How do we benefit from seizing the means of production of Apple while also knowing that the actual structure of Apple requires blood, genocide, exploitation, and this, that, and the third? And then my second question is, if the goal is a new socialist mass culture where bigotry is unthinkable, how do we deal with religion, especially the religions that center an anointed versus damned dichotomy that can contribute to bigoted thinking?
Great. Thank you. Any other questions in person? Raise your hand high. Let's take you. And then we'll take the person back.
My question is, what do you guys anticipate the international community and other Western countries' reactions to a socialist revolution and uprising in America, which is the belly of the beast. So yeah.
Thank you. So my question was, I think earlier you talked about abolishing the idea of drug patents specifically. My question was, how would you go about doing that in the current system? Obviously, it's one of their most profitable means of, it's one of their most profitable resources, so how would you go about abolishing something like a drug patent? Are there any like past examples of something like that?
Do y'all want to take more questions in person, or do you want to start there?
Let's take a couple more.
Couple more?
Yeah.
Awesome. Raise your hand again if you had a question. I think there is. Nye, there's one person behind you.
Hi. A huge part of this movement is a centralized political and like government sector. So how do we convince people present day to use their minds not for the private sector but to work for the government? And how do we ensure that the government is trusted with the minds of those people?
Thank you. Any other questions in person? No? Okay. Do y'all feel good starting there? Oh, actually, there's one more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was a little hesitant because it's very similar to your question right there. Since socialism is an ideology and we're entertaining its practical application in today's American capitalistic society, I was wondering, I'm curious about its moral values in terms of religion and how to impact those values, like marriage equality, sexual minorities, trans rights, people who practice non-traditional relationship models. How would we be able to influence the belief system in that ideology?
Any final questions in person for this round? Great. Okay. Want to start there?
You want to begin, and I'll fill in whichever ones you don't. You want me to go first? Okay. Okay. Great questions. Starting with the hard ones. Good. I mean, starting with the private sector, public sector question, perhaps, there's a certain hollowness to government in our current system. Like the idea I said, like all the things you can't vote on. So what really are you voting on? Like we're voting on how much to manage the external sort of bad byproducts of capitalism. Like how much the people who are thrown off of their homes, people who are thrown out of their homes, how many programs will be set up for them, or will they not be, will they be taken away? Or do we have an additional health care program for people who are too poor to afford it? Or how can we deal with the environmental cleanup for the disaster that's already happened? Or how do we sort of guard against certain problems that the capitalists are already doing that we have no control over? How can we create a rental assistance program, not to lower the rents, but to help a poor person basically subsidize to pay more money directly to the landlord? Rental assistance is a subsidy to the landlord, really, right? Or food stamps is just sending money directly right back to the same big agricultural company. So there's a certain element of what the public sector is, what the government is under capitalism, where I think the reason why people are so disengaged, don't want to participate, either don't vote or feel their vote doesn't do anything, is that they're kind of right. I mean, there's an element of it that you realize when you're engaging in sort of government decisions, you're just scratching the surface of the real power. You don't really have the real power. So I don't think you can really solve that problem too much in advance of a whole new system. I don't think it's not solved by telling people who are in the private sector to go into the public sector right now, because you're going into a public sector where like the agencies that monitor the safety of miners, they have like no resources. The mining company, you have to control the mining company if you want to deal with the conditions of mining, right? I mean, and there's I think 1,800 OSHA safety inspectors in the country. For the whole country, 1,800. There's like tens of millions of workplaces. There's 1,800 OSHA, meaning they deal with workplace safety. There's 8,000 parking meter attendants, though, in the country. So you have more people getting full-time jobs giving you parking tickets than making sure your workplace is safe. You know, so the sort of complete absurdity of the public sector has to be addressed first in order to convince people. You know, socialists, on the question of religion, and the sort of attendant issues that deal with it, because, you know, religion, socialists are dialectical materialists. We don't have an idealistic worldview, meaning we believe that the material world comes first, ideas come second, not the ideas produce the material world, fine. But to not get into a philosophical discussion of it, socialists recognize everyone's right to religion. But we also have, it's a strictly secular state that doesn't allow essentially religious views to be imposed either in the name of religion explicitly, like there's obviously no theocracy, or even implicitly, that the values of one religion don't end up just because they represent the majority being imposed on everyone else. But socialists do recognize everyone's right to practice their religion as a matter of personal liberty. To the question of like how families are organized, the Cuban example is super interesting. Now, Cuba has a history, like the rest of Latin America, of extreme homophobia that it inherited with its revolution. And the revolution was did not change that overnight. In fact, a lot of the anti-LGBT prejudices you can find within the revolutionary camp and in the counter-revolutionary camp. In fact, in the great mass of Cuban society. In the early 1960s and into the 1970s. But there was a process of rectification, of recognizing the mistakes that were made, and of recognizing that in this present moment in Cuba, for instance, they had to initiate a whole society-wide dialogue about how the traditional patriarchal family no longer reflects the Cuban reality. And so now they have a family code that was passed 3 years ago, which I think I really recommend everyone read about, where basically people create whatever family structure they want and tell the state, this is my family. And the state then confers the same privileges or the same rights to that family regardless of how it's internally organized. So you can have aunts and nieces, and that's a family. If they say that's their family unit, and every family unit gets X, Y, and Z, then that's the family unit. The state doesn't intervene and say that's not a proper family unit. So it's not, again, it's sort of recognizing at the level of personal liberty and the flexibility and fluidity of a lot of family structures today, and not trying to impose something that's honestly carried over from feudal society, patriarchal society, and try to impose it under socialism. But that's been a long process, and I think a future socialist society should start by studying the Cuban family code. And there's many other examples from socialism, and I don't want to make it seem like everyone's done the same thing on that. Why don't you do the drug pan?
Yeah. I actually wanted to build a little bit more on the family code policy that Cuba passed a few years ago. They actually passed one immediately after the revolution in the 60s, but this is essentially a renewal of that original policy. And the thing I wanted to kind of speak to is that, so what the family code essentially did in this new period is that it expanded LGBTQ rights. It provided certain protections against domestic violence. It enshrined the right to abortion, etc. But what's most interesting about, I think, the process through which this was done, it was not a top-down process. Meaning the socialist government could have just come up with this policy and then said, okay, we're passing this, now everybody just follow it. You don't really have the buy-in of the people. You haven't really transformed the consciousness of the people around what you're trying to actually push forward if it's just top-down. And what took place in Cuba is thousands and thousands of meetings at the neighborhood level, at the community level, at the regional level, where people debated, discussed, basically contributed to the shaping, to the drafting of the family code. And then at a later point, they took a vote, and the supermajority of the people, millions of people who voted, actually wanted this to pass. But this process actually is very transformative for the mass consciousness of the people in Cuba who took part in that process of debate and discussion. Because if it were to be passed without that debate and discussion, then all you have is a policy. It's not actually going to be practiced by the people. So that's actually how you can use mass education campaigns under socialism to essentially fight bigoted, ideology and to advance progressive ideas in society. I'll speak briefly to the point about the drug patents. Drug patents are a form of private property, and under the capitalist system as it stands inside the United States, they're not going to be abolished. And because of the vested interest of the pharmaceutical industry in maintaining this form of private property. They would be abolished if the goal was to actually have healthcare and drugs, meaning medications, reach the vast majority of the population to improve the health of the whole nation. But that's not their incentive, that's not their motivation. Their motivation is profit. And in Cuba, during the pandemic, Cuba was able to produce 5 vaccines on its own, and it was willing to share it with the rest of the world. And there are no drug patents in Cuba. There is no concept of competition between scientists in Cuba. There's technological sharing in Cuba, and they were able to achieve this in spite of the sanctions and the criminal blockade, the US blockade. So it speaks to the fact that this could be done, that you don't need drug patents, but under the system as it stands, this will not be, the capitalist ruling class, the political leadership in this country does not have the political will to abolish these patents because the healthcare industry and science and technology is all geared towards profit making.
Okay, thank you. And then related to sort of the international implications, which I think are hugely important, it also relates to the intellectual property. Like, what is Apple actually? Like, why? Apple took in $300 and almost $400 billion in revenue last year. That's not even talking about, that's revenue, that means sales. We're not talking about their stock valuation, $400 billion. But very few iPhone products are actually made in the United States, or the minerals, right? The so-called conflict minerals mostly come from Africa, and most of the assembly happens in China. Now in India somewhat, and some other countries they've tried to diversify because of the tariffs. But basically, if you look at every other stage of where that 400 billion, where the money that comes from the sale of the iPhone, very little of it goes back to the people who actually made the iPhone. All of it is basically, you're paying for the brand. You're paying for the intellectual property. Apple is saying, because we developed the software for the iPhone, and because we put the little Apple on it, that's what you're paying for. The costs of production right now are very, very low. So the profit is huge. So what does it mean to abolish the profit motive in developing cell phones? Because we're still going to develop cell phones. Well, one, I would say that the cost of production, in a way, would have to go up in certain situations because they're being held artificially low in places like the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the cost of production, they're basically, Apple's they're using subcontractors to compete for who can sell them these conflict minerals at the lowest amount, and then therefore the subcontractors are each trying to find the lowest possible paid workers. So there's this race to the bottom that ends up with child labor. It's not the fact of mining that leads to child labor. It's the fact of capitalism and the pressures that capitalism puts everywhere down the line. So you could raise the wages of mining way, way up, for instance, because it's very dangerous work, very dangerous. And you could say all the things they say they're gonna do, but they never do, you could actually do. And you could say, we're only gonna buy from, because we no longer have a profit motive, we're only gonna buy from companies that do X, Y, and Z to provide for workplace safety. And then those jobs become decent jobs. And then it's not based on child labor, right? And I don't think there's no reason for the great mass of profits to come to the United States at all. Because again, we've abolished intellectual property, so why should that money not be redistributed to the people who actually made the iPhone, which are mostly in China and in Africa? So the main thing for most of us is we don't care about Apple's profits, we just want the phone. And so you could actually, by reducing the profit motive, still have the phone, and the workers basically who make it, which in this case would be mostly international workers, would have a much greater share of the profits. Global trade, I think, would be totally changed because it's basically the first world charging rent on the third world right now. So abolishing intellectual property actually is a huge advance for the historically colonized peoples because they're basically paying then to import at cost, the phones that they themselves have produced while paying a rent to the West. Same with medicine and every potential intellectual property you can think of. It's basically rent that's being charged to put the label of a Western product on it. So we probably would get rid of that label also, sort of change our conception of it. This is a Chinese-made phone. This is a Chinese and African-made phone, right? It's not an Apple-made phone. It's not an Apple-made phone. And the software that was developed and the software developers that make all these big tech so-called innovations, almost all of it comes from publicly subsidized research. Some of it in the Pentagon, a lot of it in the Pentagon. So the people have already paid for that research. And the people have paid for public health research. And then those public health researchers then spin off and privatize a drug. But that drug was actually made with public money. So it actually belongs to the public. And the banks have been bailed out by the public too. So why don't the banks belong to us? And the big agriculture also gets food subsidies. So in a way, we've already paid for all these things. We've paid for them, and now we're paid on rent to get it back, or we're asking the very people who have robbed us to then loan us money, in the case of bonds, and we're paying that off too. So the whole artifice will be different. The whole sort of construct of financial operations will be different to the benefit of the whole world. I think it would trigger mass socialist movements all across the world if the United States, because I think the US empire is the one that's imposing capitalism everywhere. Doesn't mean there aren't capitalists everywhere who would want to hold on to their system, but without the US, the deck of cards kind of falls for them.
All right, excellent. Great. Can you hear me, comrades? Awesome. All right, so there are a bunch of questions on Zoom, and they're all really, really exciting. And even if we don't get through all of them today, I know there'll be future sessions where we'll get to talk through some of these. So I'm going to read about 4 or so, and we'll see how we feel after that.
Cool.
So the first question is, how would you deal with the environmental crisis and foreign policies? Would that include reparations? The second question comes from Sky, who said, this comes from my conservative grandpa who believes communism is the devil. But Sky and their grandfather asked, how are food stores supplied under socialism? What are the sources of food?
Food stores, you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Food stores supplied. All right. This third question, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but it says, can you talk about the relationship between a socialist revolution in the US and the likelihood of socialist revolutions in other countries? I.e., how would breaking the strength and hegemony of American capitalism change global capitalism? All right.
Any more?
Yeah. Okay. McCarrick says, some people are frightened by the idea of a one-party system. Can you explain how this will look under socialism and how it would be different than the parties we have in our current system? What would the relationship between the state and the single party look like? And one more, if that's okay. Okay. What would it look like when millions of people come together to write a new constitution? How will we coordinate with one another and come to agreements with so many people? That's a thick stack. I'll pass it over to you.
You go first?
I would like to speak to the question about the one-party system. So I think the question about socialism is a question about power, power for the working class. So I think we should actually first maybe start with asking ourselves, what is the purpose of a political party? The purpose of any political party is to contend for political power. And whether it's the Democratic Party, Republican Party, they're also contending for political power. And although they represent different sections of the same, capitalist class. But what's kind of funny, but also interesting about the Democratic Party and the Republican parties is that the people that are doing the exploiting and the people that are exploited are in the same party. The people who are doing the oppressing and the people who are oppressed are in the same party. And fundamentally, under a socialist system, the capitalist parties will be outlawed. They don't have the right to exist. And that's why you have a one-party state, which is the only party that could legally exist is the party of the working class. And it doesn't mean, and think about that, if you're talking about a party of the working class, that's tens of millions of people inside a working class party who are going to have a range of opinions. They're going to have, they're going to have a range of opinions. It's not going to be monogamous. It's not, we're not all going to be thinking alike. And I just say that to say that just because it's a single party, but it has essentially a range within the single party. But the most important element, I think, is that I think the fundamental question we have to ask is, should capitalist parties have the right to exist under socialism? And our answer is no.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think, in a way, there's a theoretical answer and a historical answer. Like the history of why the different socialist governments ended up with one party is often to do with one party after another rises up in counter-revolution. Not that it was designed from the beginning. And I actually think if we think about parties differently, you could think about parties being sort of temporarily formed. But why would, if a party represents a particular section of society, why would any one particular section of society, which is what they do, or why would that section of society contend for political power over the rest of society? In fact, if you go back to the Constitutional Convention, George Washington and the like, they were opposed to parties. They were opposed to parties, actually. They didn't outlaw them, but they were opposed to parties for this reason. They said we should have one common government, therefore we won't need parties that then jockey for power to then redistribute government contracts and decisions. Like you look at what Trump's trying to do now with the Democrats. He's going to get all his people in. And Democrats come in, they get all their people in. Is that really an ideal system? But you could think of parties forming in short-term basis. For instance, if you say, the most important thing is we need to build a bridge over here, and someone else says we need to build a hospital, and we have a certain amount of resources to work with this year. You could say all the bridge people would start to organize themselves and say, we want a bridge, or whatever it is. And all the people who want to build a hospital over there. And they could have vicious debates. How could you? You are an enemy of humanity if you want the bridge or if you want the hospital. How could you neglect this? And you could have very vigorous forms of organization. It's not that socialism would preclude that. But in a way, once the decision is made and the thing has been built, we're not going to create permanent factions that are set up against each other. But there could be very different ideas for how to develop socialism as long as they're all within the socialist worldview. Because just like today, if you set up a party that said, we are for the reintroduction of chattel slavery, right? That would be like going back to a different form of existence that nobody would permit. In a way, it wouldn't even need to be banned because it's so ridiculous. if someone got up and said, we want to reintroduce capitalism because we want people to be off healthcare again, and we want people to be homeless again. Once you've experienced years of that not existing, it would be like, okay, this is not a real organization. So it's not so much about whether the government bans it or not, is that it creates, like right now we have multiple capitalist parties, but they're basically the same. So it's how to create more democratic space without creating long-standing permanent divisions in society. But I think in a way this question hasn't been fully answered because the Soviet Union tried to answer this question. At first there were multiple parties that were for revolution, but then they got invaded and they were like, everyone has to be with the program. And when you're dealing with invasion, that is often when there's a lot more political suppression of contending views. But it wasn't like Lenin in the beginning said, now let's eliminate all the parties. It was actually under the conditions of intervention, counter-revolution, and invasion that the other parties were banned. Basically as treason. Like it was like they were treasonous parties. That was the conditions under which it happened. Yes to reparations, definitely. Reparations is the cornerstone. If you read the book here, there's a lot about reparations. It's part of just rectifying the injustices of capitalism. I mean, it's really, the idea that it's controversial is kind of crazy. The form the reparations takes can take many different forms in terms of sort of priorities of investments, whether it's individual lump sums. There's many different forms it can take and it should take. It shouldn't be one thing or another. But there's also reparations that are needed to vast swaths of the world who have been, had the value stolen and brought to the West for centuries. Environmental costs, or the environmental question, I don't know if you want to speak to it more.
You could start off.
I think the environmental question has to be sort of front of mind in almost everything at this stage. We're too late in the game. If there were a socialist revolution tomorrow, every question has to be assessed not just on what are the costs of immediate production, but again, what are the hidden costs of our current economic model? So what we have here in this book is this idea of cap and convert. So for instance, if you bring together all the energy uses, all the electrical grids into one, we immediately take, instead of these hundreds of billions of dollars that are being poured into, let's say, the overproduction of data centers right now that aren't even needed at this moment, and you poured that into renewable energies. And you say, this next year we want to reduce fossil fuel use by 10%. If you did that every year for 10 years, you would get to a zero. Like maybe, so then the question becomes, okay, society, we've all decided we're going to reduce by 10%. What do we need to do? So you'd look at mass transportation, you'd look at agriculture, you'd look at housing. You'd have to look at each one and you'd task large groups of people, millions of people, with trying to reduce our fossil fuel uses. And I think actually this will create millions and millions of jobs because the fact that we're not addressing this, people say like we could automate a lot of jobs, but then a lot of these things we'd have to do. Like think about all the energy that's wasted because we have old housing. To repair the housing so that heating and air conditioning doesn't cause a massive drain on the energy grid. And if we had mass transit and transitioning more and more away from private cars. You look at high-speed rail in China. High-speed rail in China on average is 186 miles an hour. The average speed of the Acela in the United States, the fastest train in the United States, is 86 miles an hour. So high-speed rail in China is 100 miles an hour faster than what we have here. And it's a relatively poor country compared to the US in terms of GDP per capita. But you could go from New York to DC in an hour. In an hour with high-speed rail, the current high-speed rail in China, if it were brought to the United States. We have zero high-speed rail in the United States. So the whole conception of how the transportation system is organized is a huge waste of fossil fuels. The way the agriculture is organized, a huge waste. Having an agro-ecological approach to think about how do we grow more locally. Instead of like that being sort of a hipster thing or whatever for people who have middle-class jobs, like we should actually do that and try to reorganize the agricultural sector to, harmonize with the urban sector. And, I think a lot of food we waste tons of food. To the question about food, some food could be made free. We've already lowered the cost of production so much, we could just decide instead of subsidizing these big corporations, let's just subsidize produce, basic produce. Now you might think, man, that would be crazy if you went into the produce section and everything was free, somebody would come and just steal all the apples, which they might. The first day they might do that. But then they get home and they'd have a whole bushload of apples. What are they going to do with that? So the second day they might not do that. They might say, I'm only going to eat one apple today, so I'm going to take one apple. And you just sort of scan it so we can keep track of how many apples we're eating. You could think about all the basic produce that could just be made for free, honestly. Like it would just be a subsidy from the government to make sure everybody has nutritious food. Way better. And I think achievable right away, given the current level of technology in the agricultural sector. But we just want to do it where we're not shipping almonds from this part, like thousands of miles away and this and that. Like we have to think a little smarter in terms of how we're wasting our energy. The energy use of the average American household is like twice as much as in Europe, other advanced countries. And it's like 10 times more than the global south. So you can't tell me that there's nothing we can do to reduce our energy usage. We just have to have a social discussion. It's not based on shaming people. It's just like this whole system has been set up to make profits. And now we're going to set it up to meet human needs and to save the environment. And it's not about lowering anyone's living standards. We're just going to make things a lot more rational. And I think we can do it. Oh, the Constitution? The Constitutional? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit more to the conversation about climate change and how we would fight climate change. So I guess just to kind of reiterate what Ben was saying a little bit, the technology to fully transition to renewable energy actually already exists. Wind, solar, hydro, that technology already exists. The thing that doesn't exist is the political will by the political leadership and power right now, the capitalist class, to do it. The US capitalist class has no real interest in fighting climate change. Actually, none. But if you look in the year 2023 and 2024, this is under the Biden administration, the US did invest, I think, over $500 billion in renewables and clean tech. But they're not doing this because they care about the planet, they care about humanity. That's actually not what's driving them and motivating them. The thing that's motivating them is competition with China. Because China is actually commercializing the green technology, it's creating a global market for this green technology. If the US doesn't make this move now, they would essentially fall behind. That's actually what's motivating them to invest. But it's also not consistent because now you have the Trump administration and there's now a reduction in the amount of investment into green tech. I just wanted to kind of clarify that this is really only possible if we have the power, meaning working class people who care about the working class and who care about this planet. We have to have the power to actually make these decisions. And someone actually asked earlier about solidarity with the Global South and how that would look. I wanted to speak a little bit to this. First and foremost, that would mean that the new socialist government in this country would end all sanctions and blockades on other countries immediately. And the imperialist war machine would be dismantled. So that means the closing of the close to 1,000 military bases all across the world. Our troops would be brought home, and the U.S. would be denuclearized. Right now, there are some 5,500 nuclear warheads inside the U.S. They would all be denuclearized. And no one inside the U.S. should be asking any other country to denuclearize before asking our own government to do so. And then another element would be, of course, the sharing of technology, science, and really all the skills that would be at our disposal, but we would, to assist in the development of the rest of the world, which has been prevented from developing by the imperialist powers for decades and decades, but it would also happen, in the way that those countries see fit.
Okay, so I'll end on the question of the Constitution, and I actually think that it's not as complicated as we might imagine. A Constitution doesn't have to be a super long document. Like, what would a socialist Constitution look like? You don't have to say everything in one document. But I think, actually, if we were to have a revolution, of course, this class hasn't talked at all about how do you actually get there. So there's a level of we're asking people to suspend disbelief for a moment. In the same way that Edward Bellamy in his book, Looking Backward, doesn't describe exactly how they got to that future society, but he says we're there, right? And we're trying to engage in this process of getting people to think like this, because the ideas themselves become a material force when millions of people believe them and believe that this is possible. We can actually do this. We don't have every answer right now, but in the Paris Commune, Marx talked about the Paris Commune was the first experiment of workers taking control of government, 1871, and it was, they were working out the means of their own emancipation. Once having power, they start to work out what does it mean to have a workers' state. So they said no elected official could have a higher wage than the average worker. All elected officials, for instance, are instantly recallable. They did a range of very novel things and said this is what it means to be a worker state. And then the Soviet Union built on that. And then China built on that, and Cuba. And we, of course, want to study every other example, but no, we can't copy-paste from anywhere. And that the process of holding power is the most creative process itself. That all these things that we said today may be the things that get shot down in the future assemblies, that this isn't going to work. What you said in 2025 in that class is just totally impractical. But I think that there's already developing a social consensus around the idea that food should be a human right, healthcare should be a human right, housing should be a human right. These are actually, and more, we could go on. The right to a dignified retirement. There's no reason why we shouldn't have that for every person when they retire. The idea that the work week should be shorter. I think there's already consensus to a large extent, and after a revolution, there would be a much greater consensus, because you would feel at your fingertips these trillions of dollars and these huge productive enterprises that you've always been alienated from. You've never had any power over that. That's all at the fingertips of the new ruling power. So you would think, of course we need food, housing, and healthcare for everyone. The idea that these would be commodities that therefore you cannot access if you cannot purchase would immediately seem like just unnecessarily cruel. Unnecessarily cruel. In the same way that, we've already sort of internalized the right to a library is a good thing, or most of us, right? But food could be the same as a library or an ambulance, or, those things leave the world of commodities and they enter the world of publicly accessible goods and services. And so I think a constitution would really just have to unite around those basic goals and guarantees. And then how to get there would be achieved through economic planning. Ultimately, how to get there is the million-dollar question. Our organization believes in a revolution, not because we believe it's not some desire for chaos or violence or all the things that they say in the media. It's purely that the existing ruling class is not going to simply say, good idea, guys. They're fighting even a 1% tax, a 2% tax. They're taking taxes away. And taxing the rich is not even part of our program here, right? Because if you tax the rich, we're for that, taxing the rich, but then the rich are still in power. They're still deciding what to build, what to pay people, what to charge people. Those are all the decision-making is still in the hands of the rich, even when you tax them. So we're for taxing the rich, but we want to take them out of power. That's the big difference between a revolutionary socialist program and a reformist socialist program is, yes, we're for taxing the rich in the here and now, but we ultimately have to remove the Elon Musk and the Jeff Bezos and the NVIDIAs and all these people from power. But the whole question of how can we pay for that? How can we pay for this? How can we pay for, like, that's what the way they frame everything now. If the working class held economic power, there'd be no question of how you would pay for any of those things. But they're not going to just give up their power. They've designed the system to benefit them enormously. And so that's why it's going to take a lot of movement, a lot of organization, a lot of struggles against ICE, struggles to free Palestine, struggles for housing, rent freezes. All the struggles right in front of us are still our top priorities. But what unites those struggles? That's the real question. What unites those struggles? And we're putting forward as a proposal that we want people to engage in and debate is that a vision for a socialist society can be the thing that unites all of them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben and Satya. At this point, we're just about at time, but I want to invite if either of you have any final closing remarks or if you wanted to end there. Awesome. Thank you so much. Give them up one more time for Satya. And before we formally wrap up for the day, I have some closing remarks as we wrap up this class and enter into the next class. So the next class is Can Workers Run Our Society? And we're going to be talking about more concretely how a socialist economy would actually work, how it would work if it were run by workers, communities, and public institutions. And thinking even specifically like companies and corporations like Amazon and UPS, how would they work and be planned if we were in charge, and how they could actually be planned way more efficiently than they are now. And then next week, for next Tuesday and Thursday's classes, we'll enter Module 5, the final module for the course, which is called What is to be Done, and really getting at this central question, the million-dollar question, how do we actually get there? What can we start doing now on this path towards a third socialist reconstruction? And next Tuesday's class, a week from today, is actually going to be a panel, and it's going to be a panel of workers and organizers and scientists who will be at your disposal to answer all of the questions you still have from today and from the rest of the course. So there are so many more questions on the Zoom especially, so many great questions that we didn't have time to get to today. So hold your questions, and in person, I'm sure many of you also have questions too. Be sure to save those questions. Just in a few hours later today, actually, we'll share a form in the Telegram chat, certainly tonight for the course, where you can upload your questions that you have to ask for these panelists next Tuesday. We'll also send out the form via email and via the course portal soon as well. So any questions, start thinking about the questions you have for concretely what would socialism look like, how would it work, and we'll have panelists to be able to answer those questions for us next Tuesday. And then I also wanted to give a special shout out to everyone who just a couple hours ago, just earlier today, was outside, just a couple blocks away, protesting outside of the New York Times office. Because, of course, just a couple days ago, actually, the Israeli military, Israeli occupation forces, just targeted a media tent in Gaza City and assassinated 5 Palestinian journalists, right, in their campaign really against the media. And this is alongside as Israel and the United States waged a starvation campaign against the people of Gaza. And now over 300,000 children in Gaza are at risk of acute malnutrition, and already 20,000 children under the age of 5 in Gaza have been admitted for treatment for acute malnutrition. So it's incredibly, incredibly dire moment, and an incredibly important and urgent moment for all of us here in the United States to stand up and say that we reject and with everything condemn the United States' and Israel's starvation campaign against the people of Gaza and want it to end immediately, and reject and refuse the use of our tax dollars to fund a starvation campaign, a man-made famine, really. There's absolutely no reason why aid and hunger is being used against a weapon against the people of Gaza. And so the time is really urgent to be able to show our support and our solidarity with the people of Palestine and the people of Gaza. And so we want to make the call now, and we'll make it again throughout the week for all of you to show up on Saturday. This Saturday, August 16th, we'll be having a huge mass march for humanity, a national mobilization really here in New York City that'll be happening at Bryant Park, the New York Public Library steps. And it's a national mobilization. If you're not here in New York City today, obviously for all of you who are joining in person, if you're in New York City, come on Saturday. If you're in, like up to 8 cities, I think, around the country, around the East Coast, are actually busing, having dozens of people bus from all across the country to come to New York City for this mass mobilization. That's how urgent the moment is. Cities like Baltimore, Boston, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, in all these cities, you can sign up to get on a bus to come to New York City for that mobilization. You can go to answercoalition.org for information about how to get a bus ticket if you're in those cities. And of course, if you're in New York City, we ask you to join on Saturday for that really urgent mobilization. So please come, tell your friends, bring your friends and family to that. I think that's one immediate step that we can all take towards this path for a better world. So thank you so much again, Satya and Ben, for an amazing class, and thank you all so much for joining us today.